In December 1549, as documented by a contemporary witness, the library of Worcester Cathedral was raided by Edward VI's men. All manuscripts that contained Latin, liturgical texts or music were brought before Worcester's soon-to-be demoted bishop, Nicholas Heath, and set on fire, per the 1549 Act of Parliament that ordered the destruction of all Latin service books. Across the British Isles, untold numbers of music manuscripts, especially those that recorded the music used in the daily religious celebrations of the larger cathedrals and abbeys, were destroyed in similar purges. While scattered manuscripts containing plain chant do survive today, the survival of insular manuscripts containing polyphony, that is, music compositions written for two or more voice parts, is much worse, with mostly only fragmentary sources extant today. This bar graph illustrates the numbers of the surviving sources for the 13th century. William Summers and Peter Lefferts recently published a comprehensive catalogue of English 13th century polyphonic sources, and it lists 68 items that are now housed in a variety of libraries across Europe and the US, and which may represent as many as 75 distinct original manuscript sources. 17 of these 75 manuscripts are either liturgical or miscellaneous codices that contain a handful of polyphonic compositions notated amongst their other contents. The sole complete codex, copied in the British Isles and devoted solely to 13th century polyphony, is somewhat exceptional. While it was probably copied for St. Andrews in Scotland, it's actually one of the primary witnesses to the French Magnus Liber repertoire of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And the remaining 57 sources are in a fragmentary state. Some were originally rolls, possibly up to 8 of them. Thus, from this inventory of English 13th century sources, I count from between 49 to 53 possible codices that were devoted to polyphonic music, and then the 4 to 8 rolls. Of these 57 fragmentary sources, the largest portion are associated with Worcester Cathedral. Possibly representing up to 11 original codices, there are 67 folios extant from Worcester Cathedral, and they transmit 157 polyphonic compositions in various states of completeness. These Worcester fragments, to use the moniker musicologists have given them, survive only because these 13th century books of polyphony had been destroyed by Worcester's monks half a century before the dissolution, not as a political or ideological act, but for practical reasons. Unlike with plain chant, fashion in polyphony changed quickly, and the 13th century repertoire was hopelessly out of date by the late 15th century. As Rodney Thompson has shown, Worcester's monks engaged in an enthusiastic rebinding campaign around the year 1500, systematically broke apart their obsolete books and used the separated parchment folios as attractive flyleaves and pastedowns for their library books' new leather bindings. My current research project focuses on the Worcester Fragments, and more generally on the performance, composition, and copying of liturgical polyphony across the British Isles in the 13th century. Liturgical celebrations were a site of musical creativity in the later Middle Ages. Was the plain chant repertoire that had been continuously performed and added to for centuries. This plain chant repertoire also served as the basis for polyphonic improvisations, of which we have no written record, apart from the guidelines for these practices, which are documented in music theory treatises as early as the 9th century. So the sorts of questions musicologists ask when manuscripts survive of a written polyphonic tradition, as is the case in the fragments from medieval England, include the following. Why was it that a particular composition or set of compositions required writing down? What are the ways in which the pre-existing plain chant repertoire was incorporated into these new written out compositions? And in what ways do they differ from perhaps the simpler improvised polyphony? Are there compositions that are stylistically similar, and what can such similarities tell us about the dissemination of musical repertoires and styles? Do political geographic regions stand out for their cultivation of liturgical polyphony, or is the survival of the large number of fragments from Worcester simply a fortuitous accident? And what is possible to decipher from the fragments about the organization of the original manuscript might help identify the context for performance and the reasons for copying and collecting particular repertoires. Dealing with fragments instead of intact codices adds further complexities when tackling these sorts of research questions. Significant challenges remain in simply deciphering many of the fragments. The gatherings of the original codices were disassembled into bifolios, cut into single folios or smaller pieces, sometimes pasted together or to the new bindings, and sometimes reused several times. Their ink is often faded and difficult to read, and indeed some are no longer extant, but have left offsets onto the new binding boards. Many of the original codices appear to have been relatively plain and quotidian manuscripts, at least in comparison to the professional production quality of the extant contemporaneous continental sources that have been the focus of musicological study for decades. On the other hand, the scrappiness of the insular fragmentary sources has much to reveal about the musical life and indeed the musical liveliness of these institutions. Authoritative, pristine collections like those that survive from continental Europe and around which much of the discipline of medieval musicology was built are at some remove from actual musical practice. The scribes and compilers of these display objects now stand in the researcher's way, often hiding the very aspects that speak most directly to function and use. For the remainder of this talk, then, in order to demonstrate the extent of information about musical life that can be gleaned from a few scraps of parchment, I'll present a short case study on a set of music fragments, not the Worcester Fragments, but a smaller group of 13th century fragments I'm referring to here as the Rawlinson Fragments. I'll return briefly to the implications of this case study for my future research on the Worcester Fragments at the end of this talk, and also to the clarion call for this conference as a whole, which asked of us the question, quote, "What of the medieval do we still possess, and what more might we thereby uncover?" The Rawlinson Fragments are 7 fragments of 2 rolls and 2 contiguous bifolios from what was either an unfinished codex or libellus of polyphony. On these 2 bifolios, the texts were entered and blank spaces for the musical staves, but no music was ever entered. Paleographical and codicological evidence establishes that both rolls and the unfinished codex are related to one another. In a forthcoming publication, I corroborate their relationship and also provide evidence that corroborates their dating in the 1240s and their connection to Reading Abbey, building on the earlier research of Luther Dittmer and Andrew Wathy. A scribe is common across all 3 of these original sources, the 2 rolls and the codex. A Benedictine monk named W. de Wickham, who was active in the monastic communities of Leominster and Reading as a composer of plain chant and polyphony, and possibly as a precentor in charge of his community's musical life for a number of years. The layout of the music actually allows one to calculate the extent of the missing music and thereby construct the original size of the folios. Here, for instance, is my reconstruction of the first roll. The Rawlinson Fragments preserve a largely unstudied repertoire unique to medieval England. In addition to a single motet and a responsory setting, 12 three-voice polyphonic Alleluias are copied on these fragments. While polyphonic Alleluias are both well-known and central to the continental repertoire of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and which as a collection, musicologists term the Magnus Liber, these insular Alleluia settings are quite different. Most significantly, while they were composed on the text and pitches of original plain chants, newly composed texts are provided for the upper voices. That is, these insular compositions are polytextual chant settings. To clarify these differences, I'll briefly outline an Alleluia from the Parisian Magnus Liber and then one from the Rawlinson Fragments. This is the Alleluia Dia Sanctificatus, which was sung on Christmas Day. This is a two-voice setting, here shown from the W1 manuscript of the Magnus Liber. It is copied in score. The original pitches and the text of the plain chant were sung in the tenor voice, and the upper voice here provides new harmonies against the plain chant. There are lengthy passages where the tenor holds the plain chant pitches in a sustained style, and the upper voice provides a flowery elaboration above. These passages are contrasted with other passages where the tenor and the upper voice move together in a more rhythmically patterned motion. In the Rawlinson Fragments, the Alleluia Dia Sanctificatus, which was copied in separate parts on the roll, but which I have transcribed into score here, the tenor voice still sings the original pitches and text of the plain chant, but in certain passages new poetic text were provided for the two upper voices. So here, instead of a contrast between the sustained note style and the more rhythmic style we found in the Magnus Liber Alleluia, the contrast in this insular Alleluia is between passages where all three voices sing the same words at the same time, with uppercase letters in the score here, and passages where the three voices sing different words at the same time. Now, the Parisian Magnus Liber repertoire does have a significant number of compositions where newly composed poetic texts written for one or two upper voices are associated with plain chant excerpts sung in the tenor voice, and very often these excerpts are from Alleluias. These comprise a new genre that emerged in the 13th century called the motet, and in the large a separate section or fascicle of the manuscripts that were dedicated completely to this genre. By contrast, W. of Wykeham's Alleluias with new words are settings of entire plain chants, not excerpts. Taken alone, these 12 Alleluias might be considered as examples of one individual's idiosyncratic approach in their blending of the Parisian Manus Liber style of setting plain chants and the approach that was taken when composing motets. However, Wykeham's 12 Alleluias are but a subset, and probably the earliest examples of, a much larger and mostly unstudied English tradition of adding new poetic texts to Alleluia plain chants, of which I have counted from the extant insular fragments 46 such compositions, with a further 41 settings documented but which do not survive. It is also surprising how many of these 46 Alleluias are transmitted in a relatively small number of manuscripts. 8 fragmentary sources transmit 3 or more of these Alleluias. The largest collection of these is from Worcester. One of the reconstructed polyphonic codices from Worcester, known as Reconstruction 2, has 11 of these polyphonic Alleluias. And 5 of the 8 sources transmit only Alleluia settings. Thus, it is entirely possible that, of the subset of extant fragmentary sources of polyphonic Alleluias listed here, as many as 5 represent larger codices or labelli that were dedicated to collections of Alleluias. Well, there's no time to go into much detail on this today. My analysis of these English Alleluia settings also points to intriguing overlaps with a plain chant compositional technique and genre, termed prosula, where composers added new words to elaborate on pre-existing plain chants. The problem with associating the 13th century English polyphonic Alleluias described so far with this plain chant tradition of Alleluia prosulas is that while the Alleluia plain chant prosulas flourished on the continent from the 9th to the 11th centuries, it was a particularly popular genre of plain chant composition in Aquitaine, northern Italy, and in Benevento. Their popularity and continued composition and transmission after about the year 1100 is less clear. Furthermore, virtually none are known from the British Isles. One fragment of 9 surviving plain chant Alleluia prosulas is extant, however, from Worcester Cathedral, and offers evidence that prosulated Alleluias were known and performed at least to some extent in the British Isles, despite their absence from other plain chant books. And here's an example of one. I've superimposed the original chant words so you can see how many more words have been added to the original plain chant text. It may be the case that knowledge or practice of how to sing and compose plain chant Alleluia prosulas was somewhat localized to Worcester Cathedral, since these 2 folios are the sole witness to this tradition in the British Isles, and only became more broadly known and eventually written down in polyphonic versions in the 13th century. This is an avenue of research I plan to investigate further. My thoughts now are that the extensive survival of the English polyphonic Alleluias with these newly added texts suggests that collections of polyphonic prosulas grouped according to genre, in this case the Alleluia, may have been regularly copied in the British Isles in discrete fascicles or labelli or rolls. The Rawlinson Fragments 2 rolls, copied by W. of Wykeham, could have been a compositional or fair copy draft for such a collection, and then the bifolios of the text booklet were scrappage from a purpose-copied formal codex of polyphonic music, intended as a book of Alleluias. For those of us interested in the emergence and development of the motet in the 13th century, These collections of insular polyphonic Alleluias also reopen broader questions about the copying and performance practices of liturgical polyphony, not only in the British Isles but across Europe. This needs further teasing out, but it is possible that the extant compositions surviving in this group of 8 fragments are evidence of local improvisational practices of performing Alleluia plainchant prosulas as polyphony, that were simpler and less virtuosic, but perhaps diffused more widely than the more elaborate Parisian Manus Liber compositions. During the 13th century, this insular improvisational practice of singing Alleluias became part of the literate tradition and thus survived to the present day in these fragments. When scribes and precentors like W. de Wickham began copying and circulating their Alleluias in polyphonic tropers that preserved the repertoire that was localized to particular institutions.